The wind had teeth that night, sharp, cold things that bit through pine and porch alike, whistling like old ghosts through the slats of the half-mended cabin. Snow fell heavy, sideways, thick as wool, blanketing the world in silence and sorrow. It was the kind of night the plains folk feared most, not because of wolves or raiders, but because of the stillness it brought, and what memories might surface in that hush. Ellen Dane swung the axe with rhythm, her breath pluming like a ghost before her. Her skirts were tucked high and pinned, boots buried ankle-deep in white. Each thud of the axe echoed against the timbers, each split of frozen wood another answer to the ache in her shoulders. She did not glance back at the cabin, though she knew her children were watching her from the frosted window, their small faces round and pressed against the glass like pale moons. Inside, warmth flickered low. A fire, built carefully from rationed kindling and twigs, did its best to stave off the winter creeping through every crack. Beside it sat her boy and girl, twin souls born in a summer storm 8 years before. Their names were Ruth and Josiah, but she rarely used them aloud. Names felt like promises, and Ellen had learned to keep promises quiet. "Ma looks cold," Josiah whispered, voice hoarse from a day of silence. He did not often speak first. Ruth reached for his hand and held it without speaking. They waited, watching as their mother worked in the blizzard. When she finally came inside, the storm followed her, white and wild on her shoulders, her lashes iced, her scarf stiff with frost. She shut the door with her hip, dropped the wood with a sigh, and turned toward the fire. She gave the children a nod. No words. Just a nod. She wasn't cruel. But kindness had become something she carried in quiet gestures, a hand on a head, a blanket pulled snug. Her voice was low and worn, like a riverbed smoothed by time and flood alike. They ate in silence, save the crackle of pine wood. Cornbread and turnips boiled in salt water. Nothing more. Josiah tried not to grimace. Ruth chewed with care, as if gratitude might flavor the blandness. Ellen watched them eat, knees drawn up beneath her woolen skirts, and her gaze softened, if only slightly. She had once imagined this moment, firelight on their cheeks, the cabin full of warmth and stories. But the man she'd built that dream with had never been the kind to bring stories to life. He died last spring on a failed trading run, some 15 miles east near Copper Ridge. Fell under his own wagon while drunk, they said. She'd received the news with dry eyes and a strange sort of calm, as if part of her had known he'd leave without a proper goodbye. He'd left her before, in other ways. After supper, Ellen tucked the children into their shared bed, laid thick quilts over their small forms, and pressed a kiss to Ruth's forehead. She paused at Josiah's side, her hand brushing his curls, so much like his father's, only softer. He looked up at her, blinking slow. "Are we gonna be all right if the snow don't stop?" She studied him. A boy pretending not to be afraid. "Snow always stops," she said. Then came the sound, thin, distant, like something between a groan and a cry. The wind moaned, but this was not the wind. Ellen stood still. Years of living alone on the edge of nowhere had taught her the language of storms, of creatures, of danger. This sound was not born of nature. It was human. "Stay here," she said, already reaching for her shawl, the hunting knife from the shelf. Her hands were steady. Her heart, quieter than it should have been. She stepped into the night. The snow blinded. Lantern light barely carved the darkness, a trembling gold that made shadows crawl. She moved past the barn, toward the edge of the corral, where the sound had come from. There he was, half buried in snow, like a forgotten scarecrow dropped by the wind. Blood stained the white around him, spreading slowly like rust in water. His face was turned to the side, and in the flickering light, she saw copper-toned skin, high cheekbones, dark hair tangled with frost. Comanche. Her breath caught, not from fear, not entirely. He wasn't moving. One arm was bent beneath him, the other stretched out as if he'd crawled the last yards on will alone. His chest rose in shallow jerks. A raider. And yet, she crouched beside him, fingers to his neck. Faint pulse. Hot skin, despite the cold. Fever. Wound to the side, old, likely infected. Bruising down his ribs. She didn't know what story he carried, but it had ended here, in her snow at her feet. She should leave him. Let nature finish the work that whatever violence began. She owed nothing. Her husband's grave sat not 50 feet from here, cold, bitter reminder of how trust could curdle. He had bled into her land. Died, nearly, on her doorstep. She could not explain it, but she saw something not just broken in him, but enduring. Like the mountains after a fire. Ruth's voice carried on the wind. Ma. Ellen looked toward the cabin. Her children, waiting. She sheathed her knife. I ain't doing this for you, she whispered to the man in the snow. I'm doing it for them. Dragging him was like pulling stone through the storm. She looped her arms under his, grunting with effort, boots sliding on ice, each breath a burn. The snow swallowed them as they moved, two shadows stitched by need and chance. Inside, the heat welcomed them like an old friend unsure if it should stay. The children gasped when she heaved the stranger onto the floor near the fire. Get me the clean rags, she said. The whiskey, too. Ruth obeyed without question. Josiah hovered behind, wide-eyed. Is he bad? He whispered. He's hurt, she answered. That's all we know for now. She cut away the crusted shirt, revealing skin marred by old scars and new wounds. He was lean, built like a hawk, nothing wasted, everything honed. She pressed cloth to the torn flesh near his ribs. He winced but did not wake. The twins watched, silent. She cleaned the wound, poured whiskey across it. His breath hitched. One eye opened, just barely, a flicker of amber, sharp and clouded with pain. He met her gaze for a moment, confusion dancing there like smoke. Then he passed out again. Ellen sat back, wiping her hands on her skirt. The storm outside raged still. The fire hissed as snow melted off his skin. She looked at her children, at the man, at the snow on his lashes. This changed everything. But she did not know how. Not yet. Only that the wind no longer sounded quite so empty. By dawn, the storm had softened into silence. No more wind clawing the shutters, no more groans from the woods beyond. Just snow, thick, blinding, untouched, layered over the earth like a burial shroud. The cabin sat half buried in it, chimney whispering smoke into a pale sky, a world muted in white. Inside, the fire cracked low and steady, a heartbeat for the house. Ellen sat beside it, sleeves rolled, face drawn, hands stained with dried blood and the ache of decision. The Comanche man lay on the floor where she'd left him, wrapped in quilts, a sheen of sweat coating his brow. His wound had stopped bleeding, but the fever remained. He murmured in a language she didn't know, restless, body turning slightly as if fleeing something even in sleep. The children watched from their corner, wrapped in their own blanket like fledglings in a nest. Josiah chewed at a thread on the hem. Ruth stared at the man, eyes steady, as if trying to decide what he was. He hadn't moved since midnight. His breathing had slowed some, no longer so ragged, but Ellen knew infection was a shadow with many forms. She'd seen men die days after wounds looked clean. She'd seen the way fever could curl a body like fire-curling paper. She rose slowly, knees stiff from hours on the floor, and dipped a rag into the basin. She pressed it gently to his forehead. His skin was burning under the cool cloth, yet a tremble ran through his limbs like he was made of snow. When he stirred, it wasn't from pain, it was from thirst. His lips parted slightly, cracked and dry. She reached for the tin cup by the fire, brought it to his mouth. He sipped without opening his eyes, but swallowed with effort. His throat worked, and then, barely above a whisper, he said something. She didn't catch it. His voice was gravel. He opened one eye. Just one. Golden brown, glazed, still half lost to fever. But aware. He saw her. Not just her shape or face, her. She could tell. There was something unspoken in the way his gaze did not flinch or falter, as if he'd expected someone else and was surprised to be spared. She nodded once, as if to say yes, you're safe here, though no words passed between them. He closed his eyes again. Sleep claimed him like a tide. Later, she stepped out to check the livestock. The barn had held. The snow piled high against the doors, but the roof had not caved. The cow, Daisy, bleated once. The chickens clucked with offense at the cold. Ellen cleared what she could, fed them with slow, practiced hands, then returned to the house with a bundle of wood and shoulders lined with frost. The stranger was awake when she came back. Not fully, but enough. He tried to sit up. Failed. Grunted low and sharp, falling back with a hiss of pain. Josiah startled at the sound, then scooted behind his sister. Ruth did not move. Ellen crossed the room and knelt. "Don't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You'll tear it worse." His eyes found hers again. This time, clearer. He lifted a hand, slow, pointing at himself. Then tapped his chest lightly and said, "Tahu." It was a name. Or something like it. She hesitated, then repeated it back, slower. "Tahu." He blinked. Almost a nod. He tried to speak again, but winced and fell silent. Ellen said nothing more. She didn't know his tongue, and he barely seemed to grasp hers. But names were a beginning, and silence had its own kind of language. The children remained wary. Josiah especially. He stayed close to her side, offering to chop kindling just to be outside. Ellen let him, watching from the window, heart twisting with old guilt. He was too young to carry suspicion, but the world had pressed it into him early. Losing a father, watching a mother carry everything, learning the language of hunger, that kind of life sharpened the edges of a child's heart. That night, Ruth brought her little wooden rabbit over to the man. Sat it beside his bed without a word. He looked at it for a long time, then at her. Nodded. When Ruth returned to her blanket, she said, "He's not bad." Ellen didn't answer. She didn't want to lie. Not to herself, not to the children. She didn't know what he was. She only knew he hadn't raised a hand. He hadn't threatened. He had bled quietly in her snow and accepted her care like it surprised him. He stayed on the floor by the fire for 4 days. Fever broke on the third, sweat soaking the quilts, his breath turning calm and even. Ellen changed the bandage twice a day, cleaned the wound, gave him broth, lifted his head when he was strong enough to drink. He never asked why. He only watched, listened. Said her name one evening when the light was low. His voice rough but deliberate. "Ellen." She looked up. The children were already asleep. Snow whispered against the window pane. "Yes," she said. He looked away then, as if the word itself had cost him something. His hands were calloused, the scars along his arms shaped like history carved in flesh. He had been through wars, maybe not all the kind with bullets. He sat up the next morning on his own. Shaky, slow, but upright. The firelight cast golden rings across his face. His hair was loose now, dried, pushed back behind his ears. He looked younger than she'd first thought. Not boyish, but not old. Perhaps 30. Perhaps 30 lives lived already. He gestured to the door, made the sign of walking. She understood. She shook her head. "You need another day." He tilted his head, then nodded. Accepted it. That was the strange thing, how easily he accepted her guidance. Not out of weakness, but as if he trusted her judgment more than his own stubbornness. That afternoon, while he dozed, Ellen sat beside the hearth, knitting another patch into Josiah's coat. She glanced at the man's form, his chest rising slowly, his fingers twitching now and then in sleep, and wondered what kind of world he came from. What he had seen. What had driven him this far north, into snow country, into her life. She realized then that he had not once reached for a weapon, hadn't asked for one, hadn't glanced toward her knife or the old rifle above the door. That silence carried weight. A knock startled her. 3 sharp raps at the door. She stood, heart lurching, and opened it just enough to see. It was Ellis, neighbor down the way. A widower, rough-chinned and always smelling of pipe smoke. He'd offered to marry her once after her husband's death, but she'd known it was pity disguised as protection. "Storm finally passed," he said. "Figured I'd check in." Heard from the mail rider that someone saw tracks near your barn. She held the door firm. Could have been wolves. Ellis squinted past her. Someone in there? She didn't flinch. My brother's boy. Passing through. Sick. He studied her. You ought to be careful, Ellen. There's Comanche raiders been sighted south of here. If you're hiding something. I'm not, she said, calm as a still pond. He looked at her like a man measuring the strength of a fence post before leaning on it. Then nodded, false friendly. Well, let me know if you need help. She shut the door before he finished the sentence. The man by the fire, Tahu, had not stirred. Or maybe he had and pretended not to. Either way, she said nothing. That night, while the children slept, Tahu stood for the first time. She helped him to the chair near the fire. He nodded once in thanks. They sat like that a long while, two silhouettes held by flickering flame, saying nothing. Just the sound of the wind beginning again, gentler this time. Less teeth, more hush. Finally she asked, "Will more come?" He hesitated, then shook his head. No. One word. Heavy with everything he'd chosen not to say. She watched the snow melt off his boots. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the only ghost in the room. Tomorrow, perhaps, she would ask more. But tonight, the fire was enough. The snow softened into mud by the second week of March, leaving the world raw and dripping. Icicles wept from the eaves, and the wind, once cruel and cutting, grew shy, content to rattle loose shutters and sigh across the prairie. Spring had not arrived yet, not truly, but its promise hung in the air like the scent of lilac not yet bloomed. And in that thawing world, something else began to warm, the space between the Comanche and the widow. Tahu no longer slept by the fire. He had taken to the small corner near the hearth, where he fashioned a sleeping mat from spare quilts and pine boughs he gathered from the woods. His movements were careful, quiet, deliberate. He did not linger where he wasn't needed. And Ellen noticed, he never turned his back to the children, nor to her. He stayed open, visible, unthreatening, as though aware of how every inch of silence mattered in earning trust. He did not speak much, though his vocabulary was growing. He learned the names of the twins, Ruth and Josiah, and said them with a softness that surprised her. When he spoke Ellen's name, it was always slow, measured, as if it tasted of reverence. He called her Elin, the second syllable catching in his throat like a half-finished song. She didn't ask questions. Not yet. Some truths come bruised and slow, needing quiet to surface. The children had thawed faster than she expected. Ruth took to showing him her drawings, made with charcoal on scrap cloth. She explained each image solemnly, and though he didn't always understand the words, he nodded as if they mattered. Josiah still watched him warily, but that watchfulness had begun to soften. He no longer clung to her skirts or avoided the hearth when Tahu was near. Instead, one morning, Ellen woke to find Josiah sitting cross-legged on the floor, showing Tahu a pine whistle he'd carved. The boy didn't say much, just offered the object with shy fingers. Tahu examined it, blew into it once, producing a high, sweet note, and smiled. A quiet smile, barely there, but real. Josiah smiled back. That was the morning Ellen caught herself watching them and feeling something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even relief. It was the unsettling warmth of hope. And hope, she'd learned, was a dangerous thing to let grow unguarded. Later that day, she and Tahu worked side by side to mend the chicken coop roof. He climbed the ladder without asking. When she passed him nails, their hands brushed, and neither flinched. She watched him work, how his hands moved with reverence. He handled even broken wood like it deserved a second chance. "You've done this before," she said, breaking their usual quiet. He nodded once. "Build much? For your people?" He glanced down at her, then back at the sky. "For wife. Long ago." The wind tugged at her skirt then. She did not speak. She did not ask more. But she remembered the way his eyes changed, how they dimmed just slightly, like clouds slipping over a sun that had shone too briefly. That night, he lit the fire without being asked. She let him. They settled into something not quite routine but familiar. He fished near the creek, brought back trout he cleaned and offered wordlessly. She made soup. He split logs without prompting. She repaired his shirt, one stitch at a time, while he sat near the window carving a wooden bird for Ruth. There were no grand gestures. Just the small, quiet offerings people make when they want to stay. Once, in the hush between dusk and sleep, she found herself standing by the window, watching the fields beyond the house. The moon carved silver into the earth. She felt him approach before she heard him. "Why did you not leave?" she asked. "After the fever passed." He was quiet for a long time. "I would not leave children," he said at last. She turned then, surprised by the answer, by its simplicity. "You stayed for them?" He met her gaze. "They gave me name. Not savage, not ghost, just Tahu." She swallowed. The fire crackled behind them. His face, lit in that glow, was solemn but soft. "Where would you go?" she asked. "Nowhere," he said, and then, after a breath, "No one waits." So she nodded, said no more. In the days that followed, the bond deepened not through confessions, but through gestures. He helped Josiah learn to knot fishing line. He wove a simple bracelet of dried grass for Ruth, who wore it proudly on her wrist. He carved another whistle, gave it to Ellen. She didn't know what to do with it, not at first. She kept it by the fire, but sometimes, when the children slept, she lifted it to her lips and played the softest note into the night. He watched her when she didn't notice. She watched him when he spoke to the children. They orbited each other in growing warmth. Then came Ellis again. He arrived unannounced, riding his horse straight up to the porch as if it were his own. Ellen opened the door before he could knock. "Afternoon," he said, looking past her into the cabin. "Thought I'd check in again. Strange tracks near the river. Saw smoke from your chimney all week." "We've been burning wood," she said flatly. "Cold lingers." His gaze slid past her shoulder again. "That nephew of yours still around?" She didn't blink. "He's helping with chores. Needed a place to heal. Lot of folks wouldn't be so charitable." "I'm not most folks." His face changed then, pinched around the mouth, like he was trying to decide how far to push. "You sure you're safe out here, Ellen? Man like that, he's not one of us." She stepped out onto the porch, didn't raise her voice, didn't reach for the rifle she kept behind the door. "He's done more for my children than most men ever tried, including the ones who claimed to love me." Ellis stiffened. "People talk. Let them. You're putting them kids at risk." She stepped closer. "You're not here to help me, Ellis. You're here because you can't stand the idea of a woman doing fine without your hand at her back." He opened his mouth, but she shut the door before he could answer. Inside, Tahu sat still, hadn't moved. He had heard. He always heard. That night, he went to the barn and didn't come back until after midnight. She found him sitting on a hay bale, sharpening a knife slowly, eyes far away. "You're not the danger here," she said quietly. He did not look at her. "But I bring it." She stepped closer. "If danger comes, I'll face it with my eyes open. I'd rather that than live in fear of shadows." He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that carried sorrow. "You'll leave soon," she said, not as a question. "When the ground dries." The ache that bloomed in her chest then was unexpected, and she hated it for being so tender. She turned away before he could see it. Days passed. Rain came. Then sun. The snow melted in earnest. The creek ran high. Trees budded. He planted onions beside her, knelt in the dirt with sleeves rolled and sweat on his brow. She taught him the names of herbs. He taught her a word in his tongue, nama, which he said meant enough or full. She tried it out one morning, and he laughed. Not loud, but real. It was a good laugh. She wanted to keep it. Then, one night, as twilight settled soft as breath across the plains, the children already asleep, They sat together on the porch. She offered him coffee, and he took it, though he rarely drank it. The silence between them was different now. Not empty. Not strained. "I dreamed of my wife," he said. Ellen looked at him, but said nothing. "She died with our son. Long time ago. Bad winter. No food. No help. I'm sorry." He nodded. "She had your eyes." That stole her breath for a moment. Not because of the words, but the way he said them, as if he had meant to say something else entirely, but that was the shape it came in. "I had a husband," she said after a pause. "He didn't die in war. Just slipped under the wagon drunk and never got up. I don't miss him. But I mourn what I thought he could have been." Tahu stared out at the stars. Grief is strange. Sometimes it sounds like a bird, small, always nearby. She turned her face toward the sky. A single hawk circled above the ridge, dark against dusk. "Will you stay?" she asked, surprising herself with the nakedness of it. He didn't answer right away. But then he said, "For now." And she understood that was the most he could give, and it was honest, and it was enough. She smiled. The night held its breath around them. Inside, the children stirred in their sleep. The air smelled of earth and sap. And somewhere far off, coyotes howled not in hunger, but in song. The sun returned with a sharpness, as though the land itself was stretching out of a long-held ache. It dried the last of the snow, turned the mud to clay, and coaxed the crocuses into bloom along the edge of the cabin's path. The days had grown longer, but in Ellen's chest, time felt like it had started to fold in on itself. Quiet moments lingering longer than they should, good mornings meaning more than they ever had. Tahu built a new fence line that week. The old one had bowed under winter's weight, and without being asked, he took it upon himself to right what had fallen. Josiah helped, carrying nails and a battered tin, while Ruth picked up stray scraps of wood for kindling. Ellen watched them from the porch, one hand resting lightly against her hip, the other shading her eyes. The man who had once lain dying beneath her barn now stood upright beneath a bright sky, hammer in hand, sleeves rolled to the elbows, quiet strength in every movement. He looked like he belonged. Like this land, with all its rough edges and slow forgiveness, had claimed him. But peace on the prairie never lasted long. It began with dust on the horizon. A fine, rising line, too sharp to be wind, too steady to be storm. By midday, the shape of riders had emerged, 3 of them, cutting across the ridge to the south. Ellen stood stock still on the porch, squinting hard. Tahu had already seen them. He straightened slowly, passing the hammer back to Josiah without a word. The boy, sensing something shift, looked to his mother, then to the man beside her. Tahu said only one word. "Inside." Ellen didn't argue. She ushered the children into the cabin, then turned to him. "Friends of yours." He shook his head. "Soldiers. Or hunters. Maybe worse. They're coming fast." He nodded once. "I'll talk. Like hell you will. I won't fight. Not here. Not with them watching." She knew what he meant. The children. Their eyes. The memories they'd carry if things went wrong. The riders arrived in a spray of dust and sweat. Their horses were lean, travel-hardened. The men atop them wore expressions just as worn. One was older, a wiry man with a rifle slung over his back. The second was broader, sunburnt, with a scar running from his ear to his jaw. The third was young, too young, with a face still learning how to harden but already trying. They dismounted without ceremony. "You the widow Dane?" the older one called out. Ellen stepped forward. "I am." "We're tracking a man. Injured. Comanche. Fled south after a skirmish outside Copper Ridge. Lost a few good men." Her heart tightened. "We think he came through here. Your neighbor Ellis said you had a stranger under your roof. Said he saw him out back. Of course he did." She folded her arms. "I took in no raider. Only a traveler. Sick from the storm. Never said a word about battles. You'll understand if we take a look around. Tahu stepped into view then. Not armed. Not hiding. He moved with that same quiet grace, feet steady, eyes level. "I am who you seek," he said, voice calm, rough with disuse. The men reached for their weapons. Ellen stepped between them. "He's not what you think." The broad man laughed. "Lady, we know what he is. You don't hide men like him unless you're confused or compromised. He hasn't harmed a soul. He's helped my children, saved my chickens, built that fence you're leaning on." The older man didn't blink. He was seen with a bow. "That's enough for us." Tahu raised his hand slowly, in a gesture that somehow conveyed strength, not surrender. "I ran," he said. "No fight. No blood on my hands. Men died," the young one muttered, hand still on his gun. "Maybe they were chasing someone who didn't want to die," Ellen said sharply. "Did you think of that?" The older man frowned, studying her like she was something wild and dangerous. "You've got children here. You want to risk them over a stranger." Tahu's voice was steady. "I will go. Not bring war to this place." Ellen turned to him, fury climbing her spine. "You'll do no such thing. You didn't run here to die." "I ran to live," he answered. "But I won't be the reason they burn this." The men shifted. The broad one spat in the dirt. "Turn him over, and we're done. Or we come back with more." She looked at the men, at their weapons, at the dust still clinging to their boots like blood. Then at the children inside, watching from the window. Then at Tahu, who had risked everything to be kind. She said, "Then you better come back with more." The older man studied her for a long time, then looked to Tahu. "We'll be back by week's end. If he's here, we take him. No questions." They mounted up and rode off in silence. The dust hadn't even settled before Ellen turned to Tahu, her voice trembling with controlled rage. "You were going to give yourself up." He nodded once. "I've lived hunted. I know what ends come." "Well, you're not alone anymore," she snapped. "Not in this house." That night, after the children slept, she sat beside him near the fire. "You should go," she whispered, not because she wanted him to, but because the thought of him being taken was worse. "I should," he agreed. "But you won't." "No." The silence between them was heavy, full of words not spoken. She reached for his hand. It was warm, rough, steady. "If they come again, we'll stand together." He didn't smile. But he didn't let go. In the morning, he taught Josiah how to set a snare. Ruth followed him to the creek. Ellen watched him laugh when Josiah slipped into mud and Ruth shrieked at a frog. His face, so often guarded, was open. The past had found him, and it would return. But so had something else. He had found a place where his name was not a curse, where his silence was understood, where his hands built instead of broke. And that was a reason to fight. Later, as the sun fell and the hills turned to amber, Ellen stood on the porch and watched him repair the barn door. The wind carried the scent of pine and coming rain. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Let them come." He looked over his shoulder, as if he'd heard, and nodded. The past was coming. But this time, she was not afraid. The dawn broke too quiet. No birdsong. No wind. Just a heaviness in the air, like the world itself was bracing. Ellen stood at the kitchen basin, hands still wet from washing, staring out at the empty stretch of land beyond the fence. The sky was gold and dusted with cloud, but there was no comfort in it. The kind of gold that comes before the burn. Tahu was already outside, checking the barn doors again, his movements taut and rehearsed. He'd oiled the hinges the night before. Rehung the tools. Cleared the back exit with care. He said nothing, but everything in him moved with the purpose of a man expecting something to end. Ellen had felt it too, even before the first hoofbeat cracked the morning stillness. She heard them coming before she saw them, more horses than before, 6 maybe 7. The rhythm of intent. Not a neighborly visit. not an inquiry. This was a storm on horseback, and it was riding straight toward them. She stepped outside, rifle in hand, not raised but not hidden. Tahu joined her at the edge of the porch, his shoulders drawn tight beneath the threadbare cotton shirt she'd mended only a week ago. The same shirt he'd worn the day he taught Ruth how to listen for trout under running water. The shirt Josiah had tried to patch himself, just to be like him. They stood side by side, unmoving. The riders came into view through the dust, Ellis at the front, smug and stiff-backed, followed by the three who had come before, and more now, armed men from nearby homesteads, their eyes already full of verdict. Ellis didn't dismount. He looked down at Ellen with a face he might have once used to appraise cattle. His voice carried like a hammer. "You had your warning. This is your last. You bring all these men to kill one?" Ellen asked, calm, but only just. "Or did you come for me too?" Ellis narrowed his eyes. "We came to protect what's left of decency in this valley. You're harboring a killer." "He's not a killer," she said. "But I might become one if you keep your hand on that rifle." One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle. Nervous. The others were harder, colder. Tahu remained silent, still beside her, the weight of every war he'd lived before resting across his shoulders like old chainmail. The older man with the scar, Madden, she remembered now, spoke up. "This don't have to go bad, ma'am. Just step aside." But she didn't. She stepped forward. "Not this time," she said. "You men didn't come for justice. You came to make an example of someone who didn't kneel when you called. You came because a woman stood up and didn't ask for your help." Madden frowned. "You're choosing him over your own?" She met his eyes without blinking. "He is my own." Behind her, inside the cabin, the children were quiet. She had told them to go into the root cellar when they heard the horses. Ruth had cried. Josiah had clenched his fists so tight his knuckles turned white. She'd held them both until their breath slowed, and kissed their heads like she might never again. A rider moved his hand to his rifle. The barn door burst open. Tahu stepped forward now, but not to attack. He threw something small into the dirt. His knife. The one he'd carved handles into with bear claw etchings. A peace offering. Or maybe a line in the sand. "I will not run," he said. "But I will not be taken." Ellis's face curled. "Tired of this." He raised his rifle. The gunshot cracked like the world splitting. But it wasn't Tahu who fired. It was Ellen. Her rifle smoked. Ellis's hat flew from his head as the bullet carved through the brim. He jerked back, startled, almost fell from his horse. "You shoot again," she said, voice low, "and the next one finds your heart." Another man raised his weapon. Tahu moved like wind. He tackled the rider from his horse, the two men crashing to the ground in a churn of dust and limbs. The man rolled, reaching for his sidearm, but Tahu was faster. He slammed the butt of the rifle across the man's temple. The man went limp. Gunfire erupted. Chaos bloomed. Ellen dropped behind the porch beam, loading fast, firing faster. She didn't aim to kill. She aimed to warn, to break lines, to defend. Tahu moved like something born for survival. Not rage. Not vengeance. Precision. He disarmed a second man, turned the rider's own pistol against him, held it steady until the man dropped his weapon in the dust. It didn't last long. Too many of the attackers were only brave with numbers. And numbers crumble quick when one goes down. One man screamed. He'd been winged by Ellen's bullet. Another turned and fled without a word. The boy, the youngest, dropped his gun and threw up his hands, backing away like he wanted to vanish. Madden pulled his horse around, cursing. "We'll be back," he yelled. "You're done here." Ellen stepped out from the porch, shoulders rising with every breath. She chambered another round, leveled it at him. "No," she said. "You are." The silence that followed was thick as molasses. They rode off in pieces, a broken storm, pride trailing behind them like torn flags. The air settled. The dust began to drift again. Tahu lowered his weapon. And just like that, It was done. Ellen stood still for a long while, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Her hands shook, not from fear, but from release. She looked at Tahu, his lip bleeding, his shirt torn, but standing. Still here. The children burst out of the cellar. Josiah ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist so tight she could barely breathe. Ruth ran to Tahu, threw her arms around his middle, burying her face in his side. He froze for half a heartbeat, then laid a hand gently on her head. "I thought you'd go," Ruth said, muffled. "I told you," he replied, voice raw. "I stay." Later, they buried the fight. No bodies. Just the cracked earth, the bullet holes in the barn wall, the dented porch rail. Evidence of survival. Not victory. Just survival. That night, they built a new fire in the yard. The children sat on blankets, Tahu beside them, Ellen watching from the porch steps, a mug of chicory in her hands. She looked up at the sky, velvet dark, stars scattered like prayers, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the end of danger, but the beginning of belonging. Tahu joined her, sitting without a word. She offered him the mug. He took a sip, winced. "Too bitter," he said. She smiled. "Tastes like peace to me." They sat in silence a while longer, the kind that didn't press, didn't wound. After a time, he said, "I will build a better barn." "We'll build it together," she replied. He nodded. "Home," he said, the word unfamiliar in his mouth, but not misplaced. "Home," she echoed. Then, softly, "Stay." He looked at her. Not surprised. Not hesitant. "I was never leaving." In the days that followed, neighbors came quietly. No apologies. Just gifts left on the porch. Flour. Salt. A spool of thread. Someone even left a chicken. No one said anything, but the message was clear. You were right. We were wrong. We won't speak of it. Ellen accepted each offering with quiet grace. The barn was rebuilt with new wood and old hands. The children helped. Tahu carved their names into one of the beams. Ellen carved hers beside his. On a spring evening, with golden light stretching across the valley, they stood together in the doorway of their new life. And as the sun dipped low, setting fire to the horizon, Ellen turned to him, hand slipping into his. "You changed my life," she whispered. He shook his head. "You saved mine." They stood in silence as the land breathed with them. And something in the wind sounded like a lullaby. If this story stirred something in your heart, if you felt the firelight and heard the hush between two souls learning to trust, then don't go quietly. Like, comment, and subscribe for more Wild West stories woven from grit and grace. And tell me, from where in this wide, wide world are you watching tonight?